We talk quite a bit here about media elite, economic warfare, and corporatism. A respected journalist is taking a look at what happens when progress appears to stop, when political stalemates, extreme wealth, and economic stagnation impact an entire society.
Joining us now is New York Times columnist Ross Douthat. He's the author of the new book, The Decadent Society, How We Became Victims of Our Own Success. Ross, it's great to see you.
Welcome.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. The book is fantastic. I had Ross on my podcast, and we had an excellent discussion. I wanted to make sure rising viewers got to hear it as well. Ross, people actually ask me all the time, they're like, what do you believe? And I guess if there was a one way to do it, I'd be like, well, just read Ross Douthat. That's the perfect crystallization. Give us a little bit of an overview of the book. I think it hits on themes that Crystal and I talk about often, which is that, the country seems top line like everything is doing well, but actually there's like a stagnation culturally, economically, across the board where something is sick in this country.
Yeah, so the book starts with the moon landing, basically, as this kind of peak of American ingenuity and daring and achievement that also coincided with peaks in other things, peaks in wage growth. We had the strongest economy in our history in the 1950s and 1960s, and also a sort of peak of cultural dynamism, right? Which, including things that conservatives like myself don't always love about the 60s and 70s, but whatever else you say about that era, a lot was happening.
Right.
And I think since then you've had basically what I call decadence, meaning sort of stagnation and decay across a lot of different measures. And you can see it obviously most sharply in Washington, D.C., where you've gone from an era when Lyndon Johnson could pass the Great Society or Ronald Reagan could have the Reagan Revolution to an era when presidents consider themselves lucky if they pass one healthcare bill or one, in Trump's case, corporate tax cut. But then I think it cuts across other areas as well. You haven't had economic catastrophe, but you've had this slow deceleration of economic growth, wage growth especially, over the last 50 years. You've had, I think this is in a way the most controversial claim, but I think it's basically true. You've had a technological stagnation too, where we've had incredible gains in one area. Software, Silicon Valley, the iPhone in your pocket is a miracle device, but other things that people expected, energy, transportation, these kind of things, haven't seen those kind of gains. And so you've had an economy where everything that's happening that's important is happening in Silicon Valley. And then when Silicon Valley tries to go affect the real economy, to revolutionize blood drawing if you're Elizabeth Holmes, right? Or office space if you're WeWork.
Or the Iowa caucuses.
Or the Iowa caucuses, right? It doesn't work. It doesn't work so well. And so I think that all adds up to a kind of foundation for the political disturbances that both of you guys talk about all the time, right? It's both, I think, Sanders and Trump are rebellions against this decadence. People saying, it's okay in America, but does it have to be this way? Wasn't there a better future we were promised?
And so dig into that term decadence and what you mean by it, because it sounds like a sort of personal failing, but you're talking about massive societal structural issues. So what exactly do you mean there? What do you lay the cause at the feet of?
Yeah, I don't have villains in the story exactly, except insofar as I think the baby boom generation became this, it started out as this force for dynamism and became this huge demographic weight on our society. You could say that I'm a little critical, but that isn't the baby boom generation's fault, although they probably should have had more kids. But so maybe I am, maybe there is a villain after all. But no, generally I think the argument I make is that it's not a sort of moral fist-shaking book that says, oh, everybody's eating too much chocolate and going to Vegas too much. It's a book that argues that this is something that happens to wealthy societies. Once you've achieved a certain level of success, it becomes easy, on the one hand, to sort of coast on your achievements, and on the other hand, to find the systems that you've built hard to reform. So if you're a politician coming in 1930s America or 1850s America, it's possible to build new things, build transformative public programs, build the Transcontinental Railroad in a way that's much harder once you have layers of bureaucracy, ancient federal programs that people are committed to. And the same goes for constitutional structure, right? The Congress of the United States used to be a dynamic body that could pass legislation, and now it's not. And that isn't, it's not that Newt Gingrich or Nancy Pelosi did this. It's that a successful system will tend to grind into sclerosis unless you can find ways to realign and reform.
So one of the things, Ross, our audience most responded to is one time I covered that column that you wrote called The Case for Bernie. And it was kind of a conservative's look at a Bernie Sanders administration. And you kind of lauded Sanders' commitment truly to economic populism. How are you thinking about him now in terms of the Democratic frontrunner?
I mean, I think the conservative case for Bernie, to the extent there is one, depends on two ideas. First, that every Democratic president is going to be constrained by the decadence that I've described, right? So even though I'm a critic of decadence, when it comes to a left-wing president, I'm sort of a believer in it. So my assumption is that Sanders will come in and do a little more redistribution, which I'm some sort of conservative populist. I don't think a little more redistribution is a bad thing. And he won't succeed in banning fracking and abolishing private health insurance. So that's one assumption. The other assumption, which certainly could be wrong, is that, at his core, Sanders, he's an economics guy. Yeah. He wants to soak the rich. He hates the billionaires. You can see it. And the sort of culture war side of liberalism, the stuff that you and I think are most anxious about, is not his natural. It's not his natural form and method.
Right.
So, given a choice between, getting the IRS to crack down on, tax cheaters and going after the little sisters of the poor for not covering the morning after pill, I think Sanders will always choose the IRS.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, there's a sort of woke penumbra around Sanders that will staff federal agencies and occupy the White House and might make that kind of conservative case for him look a little ridiculous when he's actually president.
Do you think that there are many people who agree with you? I mean, I hear that perspective a lot on this show with my wonderful co-host here. But I'm just curious if there's a broader sort of desire for that kind of politics or more comfort with Bernie Sanders out there in the country than a lot of, maybe other folks at the New York Times would really suspect.
I mean, I don't think there isn't a deep right-wing desire for Sanders. Fundamentally, when he gets the nomination, if he gets it, it will be socialism, socialism.
Venezuela, Castro, et cetera, et cetera.
Not, whatever kind things Donald Trump or Fox News say about Sanders now will go away. That being said, if you look at Sanders' support within the Democratic Party right now, he gets a lot of liberal voters and a lot of what remains of sort of moderate and conservative Democrats who I think are responding to this sort of economic focus. And I think among conservative writers, there's a divide. I think there's an older generation of conservative writers for whom the idea of a socialist as the Democratic nominee is the worst thing, a sign that something is just sick and amiss in America. But then the younger generation, sometimes the more Trump-friendly generation, says, look, we don't agree with Bernie, but he's speaking to the same issues that Trump spoke to, and you at least have to respect that, and we want to compete with him for voters, basically, on those grounds. So the side of Trump that, when Trump flew around the country as a candidate and went to places that had been hit hardest by globalization and gave speeches saying, we're going to bring the jobs back. That and what Sanders does speaks to this same dissatisfaction with where America has ended up. And there's something, I think, for conservative populists to appreciate in that, even if they probably aren't going to vote for Bernie in the end.
Right, I think that's right. I mean, so Ross, how do you see the election play? Do you see it playing along those lines of the Venezuela and the eating dogs and the socialism sucks? Or do you think that there is, could be a true working class, a definition of the working class and trying to get its support from the right? Because Trump himself has better political instincts than all of his advisors, understands far more than anybody that Sanders is the most potent threat to his power. Do you think that he will self-correct, or is the GOP establishment so strong that we will be running a socialism sucks campaign?
I mean, honestly, my current assumption is that the election is about to be reshaped by the coronavirus.
Yes. We've been talking about that here too.
Go out the window.
So
true. I do want to say that, but I mean, I think Trump will sort of do a two-step where, with one side of his mouth, he will talk about socialism and say we'll never be a socialist country, and Bernie loves communists and Bernie loves Venezuela. But then with the other side of his mouth, he will tout the strong economy and try and sort of hug the center on economic policy. I don't really expect him to be talking about Medicare cuts or even replacing Obamacare on the campaign trail. I expect him to come up with at least one populist foray, a middle to working class tax cut, that kind of thing. So I think he'll do both, and I think he has sound enough instincts to see that that's actually how he keeps his coalition together. The sort of Republicans horrified by socialism and the swing voters who might be attracted to a populist message, but are interested in Trump to the extent that the economy has been pretty good for low-wage workers under him. But then a lot depends, too, on what kind of campaign Sanders runs and whether he can pivot on issues where he's been pulled to the left. That's part of what's been interesting. He's the left-wing candidate, but on guns or immigration, the party has actually moved him leftward. And it'll be interesting to see if he can reclaim any of a different kind of populist center if he's the nominee.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Bloomberg is trying to get to his left on guns, attacking him from the left on guns, which I'm like, go ahead and put those ads in Texas about how Bernie is pro-gun. Go ahead.
I think the impulse that other Democrats have had, and this was true a little bit with Hillary and Bernie, to try and attack him from the left, to sort of say he's not really on the left. I think that appeals to an incredibly narrow slice of the electorate, and Democrats trying to beat Bernie are just better off saying, no, you're too far left on economics and you'll lose to Trump. Well, that seems like what Biden and others should be doing.
Yeah, I mean, like much of the Republican establishment, the Democratic establishment really doesn't understand their own voters, doesn't understand their own base, so they're not able to launch attacks up against Bernie Sanders that are fundamentally effective. Last thought on the decadence and on the book. Do you have like an idea of how to solve it? What are the solutions, right? Is this just an inevitable decline, or is there something we can do?
We're living in Rome, Ross.
The book, well, part of what the book is saying is that decadence isn't the worst thing in the world, right? That it's a negative and pessimistic book in certain ways, but I'm also saying, look, it's not the crisis that some people see happening. It's not, it's not the collapse of the Western world. And as long as decadence persists, there are opportunities under stagnation to achieve renewal. And I think, the stuff that you guys are most interested in, the ideas of different kinds of realignments on the left and right, is the political response, right? You want to have political coalitions that can actually govern the country, that aren't just running for 48% of the vote or 49% of the vote or 52 Senate seats. You want to get back to coalitions that can win landslides, and experiments like Trumpism and Sandersism are maybe one way to get there. So I think that in politics, it may not work because I think decadence is very powerful, but that's the reasonable solution. In other areas, though, it does have to start with, in certain ways, the individual and communities and families. Like, there isn't a magic bullet solution for the decline of religious institutions or the decline of the birth rate. There are choices that people have to make in their own lives and their own communities that are sort of anti-decadence choices that politics can help with but can't do for people.
Well, it can help insofar as at least making it easier.
Right. Yeah, to make those choices.
Anyway,
That's
Ross,
right.
thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you guys. Buy the book.
The Decadent Society on Amazon. It's a fantastic book.
Yeah.
Can't recommend it enough.
Thank you, Ross. Great to have you. And we'll have more for you right after this.